Hello, and welcome back for another chapter of The West Beyond the West by Gene Barman, a history of British Columbia. This is Chapter 8, Disregard of Native Peoples, 1858 to 1945. I think the thing I probably noticed the most about this chapter is it uses this was written in 1991 and revised up to like 1996, and it uses the term Indian in it as a synonym for native peoples, which wouldn't fly today. That's a change in language. Also, probably I get the sense that probably I wouldn't be surprised if there's a lot more scholarship, a lot more information on this. Probably a harder look at. Much harder look at something like the residential schools and kind of what's I think would be widely recognized now as the genocide, cultural genocide going on against Native peoples during even the period of like 1858 to 1945, definitely. Barman starts off the chapter saying, I'm working within the limitations of that the information that I am able to gather, written records that I am able to gather, is from a single perspective. It's from the European perspective. It's not from the native perspective. I would expect that as something where probably there's more native perspective now in a lot of histories. That said, she kind of goes through stuff. She starting off with that. She kind of says like, in the kind of the earlier things, like kind of leading up to 1858 and maybe going to like 1864, basically kind of the James Douglas era of the HBC, that Native peoples were treated as individuals. If a Native person did if there was a crime that they were accused of, it wasn't taken as okay, collective guilt for the whole village or tribe, and we would do retributions on all of them, which was apparently what happened in a lot of other jurisdictions in North America, where there would just be wholesale kind of retributive justice happening. It was like you'd be individuals before the law. Douglas actually made an effort to kind of purchase lands. I think this actually got covered a little bit earlier. It was like actually made an effort to like, okay, we want to settle here. We're going to purchase these lands. We do not want to cause resentments from the native community that were encroaching or stealing stuff. There was like compensation actually offered for stuff. A part of this just reflected that there was a heck of a lot less Europeans there, and that the ones that were there were doing kind of fur trade and stuff like that. It wasn't so much interested in acquiring land, cultivation, which is what really happens. Well, you get the kind of the gold rush, which just giant influx of peoples coming in, and you start seeing that pattern of just basically we're going to just shove people out of the way, and what happens is we get BC joins the Confederation of Canada, and Native peoples, instead of dealing with the provincial government, are now dealing with the federal government, and falling under what was called the Indian Act, and coming under kind of four general assumptions, myths that that this Indian Act was based on. Number one being inferiority, that the racist view that natives were inferior, savage barbarians that that they needed to be chained. They needed to learn the white man ways to be able to survive. Number two, the idea of kind of property. The Europeans' view of property was that the only way you could actually be said to properly occupy a piece of land was that you made improvements to the land, you cultivated the land, where Native peoples, not so much about kind of cultivation, about year-round occupation of thing. If like this is a territory, and then we, there's certain rights and kind of things that like, okay, I do my trapping, that I have the rights to the trapping of this area and stuff like that, which was not respected at all by the European stuff, and that thus they did not consider that they had possession of the land. And indeed, a lot of the settlers just sort of took this as a carte blanche In a lot of other parts of the country, they were actually saying like, okay, we need to legally extinguish native rights to land, which, take it as you will. And they didn't actually even, I know from the prairies thing that they didn't actually even honor these treaties. They took the land, but then didn't actually do the compensation and training that they promised. They didn't even bother doing that in BC. So that puts BC, a lot of BC land was never legally taken as it was. And number three, yeah, that native life was inferior. That it's nomadic. It's kind of the game hunting and the idea of kind of the property stuff of like potlatch, like a lot of stuff that's like not capitalist trade. Kind of, they had no that this was all seen as an inferior way of life. And just finally, the thing of that native peoples were considered doomed, that they were a dying race, that they were going to die out. Now, a part of the reason why that might have been there is because of the ravages of infectious disease that basically swept North America as more and more Europeans came into an area. They brought old world diseases to populations that had never had any exposure to this, and thus didn't have any resistances, didn't have any kind of hardiness to it. It was virgin soil infections. So that wiped out tons of people. In the kind of the recorded things of like, when there was Europeans around to actually note things down, I think they said like the smallpox epidemic in 1862 to 63 killed off like about 20,000 native people, about 60, and this is of a population of 60,000. So I'm not doing exact numbers here, but that's like a third of the population. And indeed, they fell to the complete nadir of a population in 1911 when there was only 20,000 native peoples actually left in the province, at least status, what would be considered status, because that's what the federal government did is they became the arbiters and the controllers of who was a native in BC. So with the feds, the Indian agents and missionaries were given control, and these guys kind of, it doesn't go into it as much in the West Beyond the West, and other than saying there was good Indian agents and there were bad ones, but that they held kind of life and death, that they basically could decide where you went, like what you got in the way of stuff. And while there were some that were definitely very much kind of pleading to like, we need more resources and stuff like that, they were in control. It's a very paternalistic system. Nobody got a choice in the matter. And indeed, native peoples were disenfranchised and didn't end up back as enfranchised voters until like well into like it's like the late 1940s that native peoples actually get the right to vote. And yeah, so the federal goal was kind of threefold: of the relationship to the land, that basically taking them off their own lands and herding them onto reserves, moving them out of the way. Victoria's Inner Harbor here was one of the sites of thing, but that was suddenly became attractive land. So the Songhees, they got moved off of that to a more out of sight, out of mind place. The idea of kind of just their social construction of the thing, the whole thing of hereditary chiefs, the ideas of potlatch were ways of like kind of ordering the government, of taking away kind of the religious materials, masks, totem poles going to museums, stuff like that. They're doing everything they could to kind of undermine the kind of social construct. And probably key to that, and maybe most destructive, was their idea of education and education of youth, which was pulling young people out of their family structures, putting them in residential schools where they weren't allowed to speak their own language and were given really, really substandard education. I think there was a thing here of like, a white student, European student in BC would have gotten like $200 per year spent on them, whereas it was extremely parsimonic, cheap asshole stuff of like $45 for a native student, where they were given, where they weren't actually given, they were given education because for to be laborers, to be nothing that was going to allow them to kind of rise anything in society. And indeed, there was, whenever a native people actually kind of overcame those kind of odds, they would immediately get slapped down of like, you're not going to compete with us, you're inferior. It's like there's this whole thing of being white supremacism, of like we're the superior race, yet being extremely afraid when when obviously really smart and determined people actually were able to push through that racism and start competing with them. That was like, oh well, we have to cut the money even more because we can't have them trying to compete with us, which is like, it's the horrendous kind of, yeah, that kind of racism again. It was interesting that Barman in the book said, like, it was different than the prairies in that BC is an area that has rich in kind of natural resources, so that native peoples could still have access to kind of the staples of kind of the fish, trapping, kind of a lot of, gathering kind of the berries, the fruits, the stuff that was native to the region, so they weren't as um, as at mercy to the federal government. Because I know in the prairies that, basically there's politics of starvation to break the tribes, because there was nothing there on these prairies. It was much harder life there, that way. I mean, not that it was super easy for these people as well, but there was a little bit more that they could actually do that. And I mean, Barman actually does a really good job of saying, like, these native people of BC were not just like kind of victims passively taking this stuff. She talks about the Nishka and the Squamish, and how they continually have been fighting for land rights and stuff like that, continually lodging complaints, continually working at the stuff. Talking about students, running away from these residential schools. Unfortunately, a lot of that is getting, caught by the Mounties, brought back and getting whipped, and and that sort of stuff. So it's still pretty horrible. But still with the influx, they just going from being a larger than the white population at the very beginning of all this, obviously because they were the ones here, to by the end, well, especially by 1945, being just a tiny percentage of the population, getting blocked from stuff like fisheries, getting because basically the coastal white European fisheries was basically saying stop any fishing in the interior, thus stopping the native peoples from fishing. The idea of the fur trapping, it's like a lot of the white settlers came in, they started competing with native peoples. There started to become like shortages, or like we're worried about extinctions, so they issued licenses, and but you ended up with like half the licenses owned by white people, who were then kind of confronting poachers in their territories, poachers who were native peoples who'd been trapping these areas for generations, and had native territories that had been acknowledged for all those generations under their own system, but were now considered breaking the law in the others, which is just like, it's like kind of that kind of ironic. But and also just exactly how major a part of the labor force native people were, that they were in like sort of all the industries of canning, fishing, logging, talking about native people who couldn't read or write, but were super excellent engineers, steam engineers and stuff like that. I also thought it was interesting, just because I hear about it so much in the South and the United States, of how many were of mixed heritage, of being kind of black and white, and like there's not that acknowledgement of how much of a mix there is in there. There's always that kind of that binary divide, and I don't really think about that as much with British Columbia, but the term, half-breed was used. They didn't use Métis in Canada is something specifically for French Canadian trappers and Native women. They called themselves half-breeds, and that it's like I'm people of mixed heritage. I'm not going to use the word. I'm hopefully I'm using this properly in quotes myself. But people that were of mixed heritage, this was a province where for a good hunk of the early part of it, the male population, it was like the settlers coming in were mostly males, and so there was a lot of marriages to native women. It sounded like at the beginning that was generally accepted, but kind of became more and more kind of a social taboo, and they became outcasts, where these people were not considered white, and were not considered native either. They have one guy saying like, yeah, it's like the white people don't consider me an Indian, but the Indians know that I'm not an Indian. So it's like life is very complicated. Which must be one of those kind of dry understatements of the thing. But just like how many people ended up just sort of passing one way or the other. Though you do also get the thing of the federal government, if you're the patriarchal system, if your father is a native, well, then you're a native. If your father is white, then you're white. You don't get Indian status, so you're denied any of that services that way, and also the other stuff. But just it's interesting, like they heard just Barman saying in the end that let's see if I'm on the right get myself on the right chapter, Jay. Yeah, far more British Columbians than generally acknowledged share common ancestry, which is one of those interesting things. It's also interesting, like, talking about this whole thing of it. Supposedly, this is all for assimilation. We're trying to assimilate, but even that kind of gets exposed as bullshit. Because you have like what Clifford Sifton made the point extremely bluntly in his observations in the House of Commons that, quote, we are educating these Indians to compete industrially with our own people, which seems to me very undesirable use of public money. So it's one of these things of, even when Native people kind of overcame all the barriers put in their way by this system to try and participate in what became mainstream white society, they were just slapped down. And we need to cut education more if people actually start being a success in this system that's just basically built to knock them down and destroy them. The full extent to which the federal policy supposedly promoting assimilation disguised a holding action that was even more visible in official reactions to Native people's early attempts to join together in order to seek better conditions of everyday life. Indian agents and the federal government had long been petitioned not just by the Nisga'a, but by a growing number of tribes and bands on a variety of issues, from the potlatch to land claims. Repeatedly, rejections led to more systematic organization. Unintentionally, residential schools, with their long absences from home and enforced learning of English, played a role in socializing students away from their particular band or tribe and towards a common identity as Indian people. And which, is that other thing of like, the oppression actually unites all these disparate cultures and peoples into a group that it's like, well, we're all being treated the same by the federal government, so we're going to unify as a group against them. And you get stuff like, the federal government really very much hitting back. Like 1927, federal authorities considered it prudent to amend the Indian Act to prohibit the solicitation from or receipt of money by an Indian, quote, for the prosecution of any land claim. According to Tennant, this prohibition was, quote, aimed directly at the British Columbia Indians and was intended to suppress political activity. these inferior people organizing and trying to raise money really frightened the feds, frightened the feds at the time, and they tried to smash this down. And at the same time, Native people didn't abandon or forget their traditional ways. Things like kind of, marriages were still being kind of arranged in the kind of a traditional way on stages of life cycle, retain their significance. That there was a lot of ways that they tried to, they circumvented the potlatch, which I guess I'm taking it as granted that I or whoever's watching this knows what a potlatch is. My most general idea is that this is kind of a social thing of where chiefs and stuff like that would hold gatherings, and it would be like the more their status, the more they would give away to other people, and the more that they would be kind of owed back again. It was a way of kind of unifying and holding people together by this very odd, at least from my point of view, of giving out of goods. Giving stuff away was a way of showing how big of a person you were in a society. That this is my horribly ignorant kind of thing. And just, and ideas of kind of just like, the keeping of traditional foods, that a lot of the foods that they were eating, even, by kind of Emily Carr, Carr's description could easily refer to the late 20th century. One day after work, I found the Deuce family all sitting around the floor. In the center of the group was Lizzie. She was beating something in a pail, beating it with her hands. Her arms were blobbed with pink froth to the elbows. Everyone stuck his hand into Lizzie's pail and hooked out some of the froth in the crook of his fingers, then took delicious licks. They invited me to lick it too. It was soperlael, or soapberry. It grows in the woods where you beat the berry. When you beat the berries, it froths up, and it has a queer, bitter taste, which I've never had, but Ja has had, and apparently it's quite good. So yeah, final paragraph. Despite European impositions, Indian people continued to exercise a presence in British Columbia. If from the perspective of many in the dominant society they were conveniently out of sight and therefore out of mind, Indians did not disappear. While some natives maintained the old ways, others sought to participation or even integration. On Vancouver Island, across the Fraser Valley, up the coast, and through the interior and the north, many natives participated in the paid labor force. Racism determined the character of everyday relationships, but it did not prevent these relationships from coming into being and long continuing. Both Europeans and native peoples adapted. In part because of the very disregard exhibited by the dominant society, native peoples were, if daunted, in no way subdued. So it's an interesting chapter. It's definitely, I feel the age of the book in this chapter, even in my own ignorance of like, I have a feeling that there's probably sharper and more deeper depths to go into with this. But it's good. It's a good beginning. With Beyond the West Beyond the West, it's a textbook. It's a, I would say it's probably like a kind of a university level look at the history of BC, which I'm really appreciating. It's very readable, which is probably the most important thing. If this was a popular history, it would probably be too surface to me. But if it was so dry and academic and I don't know, just unreadable, I wouldn't be able to get into it that way. It's got a good flow to it. I've been reading it out loud to you through these things, which I think hopefully shows that I'm appreciating the organizing mind of Jean Barman and her way with language behind it. It's a clear flowing language, but and lively and active with an opinion, with opinions in it, which I'm appreciating. So yeah, that's that chapter, and I am going to go on to chapter 9, Growing Self-Confidence, 1900 to 1918. So yes, from the very start of the 20th century, well, sort of the start, 1901 would be the start of the 20th century, to 1918, which is just after World War I. So yeah. So more videos later.